The rain was a needle, cold and sharp, stitching the thin fabric of his tunic to his skin. Each drop was a memory of the sterile washdowns, the antiseptic chill of the labs. But this was different. This was alive. Mud, thick and cloying, sucked at the worn soles of his slippers, a greedy mouth trying to pull him back into the earth. He fought it. He had to fight it. His lungs burned with air that was too rich, too full of the scent of pine and decay and wet stone, a chaotic perfume that overwhelmed the clean, recycled oxygen he had breathed for 19 years. His designation was Unit 734. In the forest, under the weeping grey sky, he was just a gasp, a tremor, a desperate flight from one cage into another he could not yet see. The world was a cage. He was only just learning the shape of its bars. He stumbled, his ankle twisting on a hidden root, and fell with a cry that was swallowed by the dripping canopy. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his exhausted body, but it was the stillness that followed that terrified him. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the soft, percussive rhythm of the rain on leaves. In the Institute, silence had been a tool of control, a measured absence of sound between commands, between procedures. Here the silence was vast and organic, filled with the minute sounds of life and death he was not equipped to understand. He was a creature of concrete and synthesized light, and this wild, dark place was as alien as a distant star. He pushed himself up, his palms sinking into the cold mulch of fallen leaves. His fingers, long and pale, were stained with dirt, and the sight was a shock, a violation of the pristine state he had been conditioned to maintain. He was not clean, he was not contained. The thought was a thrill of horror and a spark of something else, something he refused to name. Freedom. The word was a foreign concept, a theoretical state discussed in sanitized texts on pre-consortium history. It was chaos. It was this pain, this cold, this gnawing hunger. The nutrient paste administered at 700 and 1900 hours was a distant memory, its bland efficiency replaced by a primal, aching emptiness in his gut. His body, long a subject of clinical observation, was now a vessel of raw sensation. Every shiver, every ache, every desperate beat of his heart was a rebellion. The suppressants in his system, the delicate cocktail of hormones and inhibitors that kept his omega biology inert, were failing. He could feel it in the strange heat coiling deep in his belly, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever. He could feel it in the way the scents of the forest were beginning to sharpen, to stratify, carrying information his conscious mind could not pass, but his instincts were starting to translate. It was terrifying. He was becoming what they had always told him he was, a biological imperative, a collection of responses waiting for a stimulus. He had to keep moving. The trackers from the Institute would be methodical, relentless. They operated on logic and probability grids. They would not expect him to run into the deep woods, into the unstructured wilderness that bordered the sterile zones. It was an illogical choice, a flight into chaos. But his escape had not been logical. It had been a single, blinding moment of instinct when a service conduit had been left open, a fractional error in a perfect system. He had slipped through it like water, a ghost in the machine, and had not stopped running since. He ran from the smell of bleach and the hum of servers. He ran from the soft, sympathetic voice of Director Aris, a voice that promised care while cataloguing his every twitch and tremor. He ran from the mirror in his cell, the one that showed a pale, hollow-eyed boy with a designation tattooed below his collarbone. He was not that boy. He was not. A branch whipped across his face, leaving a stinging red line on his cheek. He barely felt it. His focus was narrowed to the next step, and the one after that. The grey light was beginning to fade, the forest sinking into a deeper, more menacing darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his resolve. The Institute was a prison, but it was a known prison. Its dangers were labelled, its outcomes predicted. This place held terrors he couldn't even imagine. He pressed a hand to his side, where a stitch was tightening like a wire. He needed to rest, just for a moment. He found a small overhang beneath a cluster of ancient, moss-covered rocks, a shallow cave that offered minimal shelter from the relentless rain. He huddled inside, curling into himself, trying to conserve what little warmth he had left. His shivering was violent, uncontrollable. He closed his eyes, and the image that swam behind his lids was not of the forest, but of the lab. The clean white walls, the glint of steel, the dispassionate gaze of the technicians. They had called him a miracle of genetic stability, a perfect baseline Omega. His purpose was to be a control group, a pristine specimen against which they could measure their modifications on others. He was a living standard. He was not a person. It was then that the scent changed. Amidst the symphony of wet earth and pine, a new note intruded. It was sharp, clean, and utterly alien. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, and beneath it, something else. Cold steel, not the sterile alloy of the Institute, but something heavier, more potent. It was the scent of a weapon, honed and ready. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Every nerve ending screamed. This was not a tracker from the Institute. Their scent was one of sterility, of chemicals and recycled air. This was something else, something wild, yet disciplined. A predator. He flattened himself against the rock, trying to make himself smaller, trying to stop the frantic pounding of his heart, certain its desperate rhythm could be heard over the rain. The silence of this forest had returned, but it was no longer empty. It was a held breath. It was the stillness of a hunter that has found its prey. He heard it then, a single sound that cut through the patter of the rain, the soft crunch of a boot on damp earth. It was a measured sound, deliberate, impossibly quiet. It was not the sound of a search party. It was the sound of a single, efficient entity moving through the darkness with absolute confidence. He held his breath until his lungs burned. The footsteps stopped. He knew, with a certainty that had no basis in logic, that they had stopped just outside his small shelter. He was trapped. The fear was a physical thing, a cold weight in his stomach that threatened to drag him down into the dirt. He squeezed his eyes shut, a futile, childish gesture. Make it go away. Let it be an animal. Let it be anything but what he knew it was. But the scent grew stronger, a clean, sharp presence that cut through his panic, and with it came a pressure, a weight in the air that seemed to press down on him, a silent announcement of dominance, of power. A shadow fell over the entrance to his hiding place, a silhouette darker than the surrounding gloom, and a voice, low and calm and devoid of any discernible emotion, spoke into the rain-soaked air. It did not ask a question. It made a statement, a classification. He risked a glance, peering through the curtain of his wet hair. The silhouette was tall, broad-shouldered, clad in something dark and functional that seemed to absorb the light. There was no visible face, only a shape of absolute authority. The scent was rolling off the figure in waves, ozone and cold steel, and something else, something deeply masculine and unsettlingly primal that made the nascent Omega inside him stir with a terrifying mix of fear and recognition. The figure took a single, deliberate step forward, and the measured cadence of his voice was as precise as his movements. Designation 734, the voice stated, not with the clinical curiosity of the Institute staff, but with the flat certainty of an identification confirmed. The use of his number was a blow, a reminder that he could not escape what he was, only where he had been. He flinched, pressing himself harder against the cold, wet rock, a silent plea for the earth to swallow him whole. The figure tilted its head, a subtle, analytical gesture, as if observing a curious specimen. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threat and a strange, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. Then the voice spoke again, 2 sentences that shattered the world he thought he understood and replaced it with a new, more terrifying paradigm. The Institute has lost its asset, the voice said, each word a perfectly polished stone. And I have found my mate. The words hung in the damp air, an impossible declaration. Mate. The term was archaic, a biological throwback studied in the Institute's archives, a concept tied to primal instincts and uncontrollable pheromonal responses. It was a word for animals, not for controlled, designated beings. He stared at the dark figure, his mind struggling to process the assertion. It was a trick, a psychological tool to ensure his compliance. It had to be. Yet the hum beneath his skin intensified, a deep, cellular vibration that answered the alpha's presence. The failing suppressants were leaving him exposed, his own biology betraying him, resonating with the calm, overwhelming power of the man before him. He could smell it now, the intricate layers of the alpha's scent, the ozone of command, the steel of a warrior, and under it all, something warm and dark like pine resin and cloves, a scent that promised both safety and subjugation. It was a scent that his body, long denied its nature, was drinking in like a dying man drinks water. Kale watched the Omega. He registered the data with cold precision. Designation 734. Age, 19 standard years. Physical condition, malnourished, exhausted, minor abrasions. Psychological state, extreme distress, fear dominant. The information flowed through his tactical overlay, neat and categorized. He had been tracking the fugitive asset for 3 cycles, a simple retrieval mission assigned by the Enclave's command. The Institute had breached protocol, allowing a valuable specimen to escape into the border wilds, and it was his duty to reclaim it. Simple, clean. But the data stream was incomplete. It did not account for the scent. When he had first entered the forest, he had filtered it out, a chaotic background noise of organic processes. But as he drew closer, one scent had pierced his filters, a delicate, complex aroma of rain-washed herbs and a faint, sweet trace of ozone, like the air after a summer storm. It was a scent that bypassed his logic centers and struck a chord deep in his primal cortex, an anomaly. He had followed it, his movements silent and efficient, driven by a new imperative that superseded his mission parameters. He found the source huddled in the dark, a shivering, pathetic creature that looked more like a frightened boy than a valuable asset. And when he was close enough, when the Omega's scent flooded his senses, unfiltered and raw, the biological certainty had hit him with the force of a physical blow. Mine. The word was not a thought, but an axiom, a truth that settled into his bones. His internal systems flagged it as an irrational, emotion-based conclusion. He ignored the flag. For the first time in his career as an Alpha Centurion, instinct was overriding protocol. He watched the boy, the Omega, tremble, and he catalogued the reaction. The wide, terrified eyes, the pale skin, the fine tremor in his limbs. He was a creature made of fear, but beneath it, Kale could feel the faintest thrum of a biological response. The resonance, the bond, unformed but undeniably present. He had stated the facts as he understood them. The Institute had lost an asset. He had found a mate. The two statements were not contradictory. They were a sequence of events. Elian. He was not Elian yet. He was 734, pushed himself back, his spine scraping against the rough stone. "No," he whispered, the word a fragile puff of air. I am not anything." It was the only defense he had, a denial of all labels, all classifications. If he was nothing, he could not be captured, could not be claimed. The Alpha took another step, entering the small overhang. He moved with a liquid grace that was unnerving in a man so large. The proximity was overwhelming. The Alpha's scent was a physical presence, wrapping around him, sinking into his clothes, his skin. It made him feel dizzy, his thoughts fraying at the edges. "Your biology disagrees," Kale said, his tone still perfectly level. It was not an argument, it was a correction of a factual error. He crouched down, not in a gesture of threat, but in a smooth, controlled motion that brought him to Elian's level. For the first time, Elian could see his face, or at least the parts of it, not obscured by the tactical helmet he wore. A strong jaw, a mouth set in a neutral line. The helmet's visor was polarized, hiding his eyes, rendering his expression machine-like and unreadable. He reached out a hand. It was gloved in black, synthetic material. Elian flinched violently, scrabbling backward until he was pressed as tightly as possible against the rock. He was hyperventilating, his vision starting to tunnel. The lab, the table, the cold touch of instruments, the dispassionate voices. The memories were a tidal wave, and he was drowning. Kyle paused, his hand hovering in the air between them. He registered the Omega's panic spike. His protocol dictated tranquilization for a hostile or distressed asset. His instinct, however, urged a different course of action. He held his position, unmoving, projecting a calm he did not entirely feel. The resonance was a distraction, a low-level hum of static in his perfect concentration. He needed to control the situation. He needed to control the Omega. He needed to understand this connection. "Breathe," he commanded, the word low and resonant. It was the tone he used to soothe startled patrol beasts, a frequency designed to calm a primal nervous system. To Elian's horror, his body responded. His ragged gasps began to slow, to even out, forced into a rhythm by the Alpha's voice. It was the ultimate violation. His own body, his own lungs, obeying a stranger's command. A fresh wave of despair washed over him. He was a machine with faulty wiring, and this Alpha knew all the codes. "I will not hurt you," Kale stated. It was a promise delivered with the weight of a physical law. And the most terrifying part was that Elian believed him. The threat this man posed was not one of violence. It was a threat of ownership, of utter and complete appropriation. He would not be hurt. He would be acquired. Kale retracted his hand slowly. The immediate mission was to get the Omega out of the elements and back to the Enclave. His physical condition was deteriorating. Later, there would be time for analysis, for understanding the deviation from the mission plan. For now, there was only the objective. "You will come with me," he said. It was not a request. He stood, a towering shadow, and waited. The choice was an illusion. There was no path that did not end with him leaving this shelter in the Alpha's custody. With a shuddering sigh that felt like the last breath of his fleeting, desperate freedom, 734 slowly, painfully, unfolded his cramped limbs and rose to his feet. He did not look at the Alpha. He looked at the rain, at the dark, indifferent trees, and mourned the loss of a wilderness he had only just begun to know. The new cage was waiting. He woke to silence, not the living silence of the forest, but a dead, manufactured quiet that hummed with the barely audible frequency of an environmental control system. It was a familiar sound, the sound of a cage. He lay still for a long time, his eyes closed, taking inventory. He was on a surface that was firm yet yielding, covered by a sheet of a coarse, synthetic fiber. The air was cool and dry, scrubbed clean of any scent. His own scent, he realized with a jolt, was muted, the herbal, stormy notes of his emerging Omega nature, dampened by the sterile atmosphere and the clean, shapeless grey tunic he now wore. His old, mud-stained garment was gone. He had been cleaned. His abrasions had been treated with a stinging, transparent film that had sealed the skin. He was a specimen again, prepared for observation. He opened his eyes. The room was a cube of muted grey. There was no window. The only light came from soft, glowing strips embedded in the ceiling, casting an even, shadowless illumination. There was the sleeping platform he was on, a small table, and a chair. That was all. It was minimalist, efficient, and utterly devoid of personality. It was a cell, a high-grade cell, but a cell nonetheless. He sat up, his muscles aching in protest. The dizziness that had plagued him in the woods was gone, replaced by a clear-headed dread. He remembered the journey, but only in fragments. The Alpha, the one who called himself his mate, had half carried him, his strength seemingly limitless. The world had been a blur of dark trees and moving shadows, and then the grey, monolithic walls of a structure that rose from the earth like a geometric mountain. A gate, a hiss of pneumatics, and then nothing. He swung his legs over the side of the platform. The floor was cold and smooth beneath his bare feet. He walked to the wall, pressing his palm against it. It was cool and unyielding. No seams, no joins. A perfect, inescapable box. He was property again. The thought landed with a dull, familiar ache. He had traded the clinical observation of the Institute for the possessive claim of an alpha warrior. He wondered which was worse. The former had seen him as data. The latter saw him as a biological destiny. Both stripped him of any choice. Both denied the existence of a person inside the designated shell. A panel in the wall slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small alcove. Inside sat a tray. On the tray was a bowl of grey paste and a bulb of water. It was the same sustenance he had received at the Institute, efficient and tasteless. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not a mate. He repeated the words in his head, a desperate mantra against the encroaching reality. He was nothing. A void. And a void could not be owned. The panel slid shut as silently as it had opened. He was being watched. Of course he was. He turned slowly, scanning the corners of the ceiling, looking for the telltale glint of an optical sensor. He found it, a tiny black lens embedded in the angle where two walls met the ceiling. It was discreet, far more so than the Institute's bulky cameras. This system was more advanced, more seamless, more inescapable. He stared at the lens, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. He would give them nothing, no fear, no defiance, only a blank slate. He would become the void he claimed to be. He did not touch the food. He sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, and he waited. Hours passed. The light from the ceiling did not change in intensity or color. There was no day or night in this box, only a perpetual, monotonous twilight. He focused on his breathing, slowing it down, mimicking the meditative states the Institute's wellness instructors had taught him. Control your body. Control your mind. It was a tool they had given him to ensure his stability as an asset, and now he would use it as a weapon against his new captors. He would show them that he was not a creature of instinct. He was a creature of will. He would starve before he accepted the paste from their invisible hands. The silence stretched on, broken only by the low hum of the air recyclers. And then a new sound. A soft click, and the wall opposite him slid open, revealing not a small alcove, but a full doorway. The Alpha stood there. He was no longer wearing the tactical helmet. For the first time, Elian saw his face clearly. It was a face carved from granite, all sharp angles and severe lines. His hair was black, cut brutally short. His eyes were a pale, piercing grey, the colour of a winter sky, and they regarded Elian with an unnerving, analytical stillness. He was dressed in a simple, dark grey uniform that mirrored the colour of the room, the high collar emphasizing the strong column of his throat. He said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway, his presence filling the small room, his scent a subtle but persistent pressure in the sterile air. It was a test, a battle of wills fought in absolute silence. Elian did not look away. He met the Alpha's gaze and held it, pouring all his desperate resolve into that single act of defiance. He would not be the first to break. Kyle observed the Omega. Subject remains stationary, refuses sustenance. Respiration and heart rate are deliberately controlled. Pupils are dilated, but not from fear, from defiance. His internal analysis was crisp, but it felt inadequate. The data did not capture the sheer force of will emanating from the slender boy on the platform. The boy was a paradox, fragile in form, yet possessing a core of unbreakable steel. This was not the trembling creature from the forest. This was something else. The resonance between them was still there, a low hum in his blood. But it was being actively resisted by the Omega. It was fascinating. Kale entered the room and the door slid shut behind him. He walked to the tray of untouched food, picked it up, and looked at the grey paste. Nutrient profile is optimal for Omega physiology post-stress, he said, his voice as calm and toneless as before. Refusal is illogical. Elian's jaw tightened. My logic is my own. The words were quiet, but they resonated in the silent room. Kyle placed the tray on the small table. He did not command Elian to eat. He simply moved the tray closer, an adjustment of variables. He then turned his attention to Elian, his grey eyes sweeping over him in a clinical assessment. Your designation is 734, correct? It is the mark they put on me, Elian replied, his voice carefully devoid of inflection. A name is a mark. I am Kale. He stated it as a simple fact, an exchange of data. Elian felt a tremor of something ugly and painful. A name. They had never given him a name. He was a unit, a number. This alpha, this warrior who had claimed him, had a name. It was another bar in the cage, a distinction of status that defined him as the lesser. "You are in my quarters," Kale continued, gesturing vaguely at the Spartan room. "You are safe here." Safe. The word was a bitter irony. He was a prisoner in his captor's room, and he was being told he was safe. Safe from what? Elian asked, the question sharp with a sarcasm he couldn't suppress. "From the Institute. They have designated you as a compromised asset. Their retrieval protocol is termination." Kyle delivered the information without a flicker of emotion. It was a tactical assessment, a death sentence described as a protocol. Elian felt the blood drain from his face. He had known, of course. An escape was a flaw in the system, and flaws were to be sterilized. But hearing it stated so baldly, so coldly, made it real. His desperate flight had not been toward freedom. It had been a race against his own execution. A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "So you have not captured me," he said softly. "You have rescued me." "The outcome is the same," Kyle replied, missing the irony entirely. "You are here. You are with me." The possessiveness in that simple statement was absolute. Elian looked at the alpha, at his calm, certain face, and felt a profound, soul-deep weariness. He had escaped the sterile logic of the scientists only to be cornered by the primal logic of the warrior. He was still a thing, an object. His only value was in relation to someone else. He was an asset to be terminated, or a mate to be possessed. The identity of the owner had changed, but the ownership remained. He lowered his gaze to his hands, resting in his lap. They were clean now, the dirt of the forest washed away. He had been processed, categorized, and placed in a new, clean container. The cage was just a different shape. Over the next several cycles, a routine established itself with the rigid precision of a military drill. The light in the room would brighten to a simulated dawn, and a tray of nutrient paste would appear. Kyle would be gone, his presence replaced by the oppressive, humming silence. Elian would sit, meditate, and refuse the food. At some point, the tray would disappear. He would spend the long, timeless period of day exploring the confines of his mind, reliving the sterile years in the Institute, dissecting them, trying to find the boy who had existed before the designation. He found only fragments, ghost images of other children in identical grey tunics, their faces blurred, their voices muted. They had been his cohort, the other baselines. They had disappeared over the years, one by one, transferred to other projects, he was told. Decommissioned, he now suspected. He was the last one, the perfect specimen. He would trace the raised lines of the designation tattoo below his collarbone, the skin smooth and numb. 7034, 7, 3, 4. The numbers were more real to him than any name. In the simulated evening, when the lights dimmed, Kyle would return. He would enter the room and sit in the single chair, observing Elian in silence for a time before speaking. Their conversations were not conversations. They were interrogations disguised as data exchanges. Kyle would ask about the Institute's procedures, about the suppressant dosages, about his physiological responses to stimuli. He spoke of Elian's body as if it were a piece of complex machinery that he was learning to operate. Elian would answer in clipped, precise sentences, giving the alpha the data he craved, but nothing more. He offered no emotion, no history, no hint of the person trapped inside the specimen. He was a living database, and he would let the Alpha access only the most superficial files. The Institute monitored your REM cycles. What did they observe? Kale asked one evening, his grey eyes fixed on Elian's face. Increased neocortex activity, a correlation with memory consolidation tasks performed during the preceding wakeful period, Elian recited, the words tasting like ash. He was quoting from his own file, a document he had once glimpsed on a technician's datapad. They did not ask what you dreamed of. The question was a deviation from Kale's usual pattern. It hinted at something beyond data, a flicker of curiosity. Elian's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. He had not dreamed in years. The suppressants and sedatives they gave him for restorative sleep had bleached his nights into a blank, dreamless void. But he remembered. He remembered the dreams he'd had as a small child before the protocols became so rigorous. Dreams of a vast, open sky he had only ever seen on a screen. Dreams of running through tall, green grass. Dreams of a woman's hand, warm and soft, holding his, a mother, a concept as alien as a mate. Dreams are chaotic data, Elian said, his voice a shield. The Institute did not concern itself with chaos. Kyle fell silent, processing this. The Enclave, his world, was built on the opposite principle. It embraced the biological chaos of alphas and omegas and betas, and it structured it, weaponized it, turned it into a rigid, unshakable hierarchy. It was a system of controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. This Omega, raised in a sterile vacuum, was a complete unknown. He was a creature who had been taught that his own nature was a flaw to be suppressed. One cycle, Elian's carefully constructed control began to fail. The hunger, a dull ache he had managed to keep at bay, sharpened into a vicious, clawing beast. His head swam, and black spots danced in his vision. He had gone without sustenance before, but his body was different now. The failing suppressants were reawakening his metabolism, demanding fuel for processes he did not understand and did not want. The heat in his belly was a constant, smoldering fire. He was meditating on the platform when the wall slid open. It was not Kyle. Two figures, dressed in the same severe, dark uniforms, stood in the doorway. They were betas, their sense neutral and unobtrusive. One held a small, metallic case. Centurion Kale has requested a full diagnostic, the first beta said, his voice flat and professional. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. A diagnostic, a procedure. He was back in the lab. He scrambled backward on the platform, a strangled noise escaping his throat. "No," he gasped. "Stay away." The betas exchanged a look. "The subject is non-compliant," the second one noted, as if Elian were not there. They advanced into the room. The panic was a white-hot explosion in his mind, erasing all his disciplined control. He was 734, on the table, the cold metal against his back, the bright light in his eyes. He saw not the betas, but the white-coated technicians of the Institute, their faces impassive behind their masks. He thrashed when they tried to touch him, his weak blows glancing harmlessly off their uniforms. It was futile. They were strong, efficient. One pinned his shoulders while the other opened the case, revealing a diagnostic scanner and a hypospray. The high-pitched whine of the scanner powering on was the sound of his nightmares. A scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate, and then the scent hit him. Ozone and steel and pine resin flooding the room, thick with a sudden, shocking rage. Kyle was there. He moved like a shadow, a blur of controlled violence. He did not shout. He did not speak. He simply grabbed the first beta by the collar of his uniform and threw him, bodily, out of the room. The second beta froze, the hypospray halfway to Elian's arm. Kyle turned his head, and the look in his pale grey eyes was utterly glacial. "Get out," he said, the words low and lethally soft. The beta scrambled to obey, leaving the case behind on the floor. The door slid shut, leaving Kyle and the hyperventilating Omega alone in the silent room. Elian was curled into a ball on the platform, his arms wrapped around his head, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was trapped in the memory, drowning in the terror of his past. He did not see Kyle, but he felt the shift in the room as the Alpha's rage subsided, replaced by something else, a tense, uncertain stillness. Kyle stood over him, his own systems in turmoil. The sight of the betas touching the Omega had triggered a primal, possessive fury he had not anticipated. It was an inefficient, illogical response. A security protocol had been violated. His security protocol. He had ordered the diagnostic. He was responsible for the Omega's distress. This was a tactical error. He knelt beside the platform, the movement slow and deliberate. "The threat is neutralized," he said, his voice a low command. "Return to baseline." But Elian could not hear him. He was lost, adrift in a sea of remembered pain. The sterile smell of the lab was in his nostrils, the cold touch of steel on his skin. Kyle hesitated. Protocol for dealing with a traumatized subject was to sedate or restrain. But the memory of Elian's violent reaction to the hypospray stayed his hand. There had to be another way. His instincts, the ones he had been trained to suppress in favor of logic, were screaming at him. An ancient biological knowledge he did not know he possessed was surfacing. Scent, calm, protect. It was a simple, powerful imperative. Slowly, deliberately, Kale released his own scent. He did not flood the room with the aggressive pheromones of dominance he used in combat. Instead, he softened it, pulling back the sharp notes of ozone and steel, and pushing forward the warmer, grounding scent of pine resin and cloves. He focused on projecting an aura of safety, of sanctuary. It was the scent an alpha used to calm a distressed member of his pack, to soothe a frightened pup, to reassure his mate. Elian felt it first as a change in the air. The imaginary, sterile smell of the lab began to recede, pushed back by a warm, enveloping fragrance. It was Kyle's scent, but changed. The sharp edges were gone, leaving only a deep, resonant warmth that seeped into his bones. It was a scent that spoke of ancient forests and quiet strength. It did not trigger his fear. It seemed to absorb it, to neutralize it. The violent trembling in his limbs began to subside. His ragged breathing started to slow. He cautiously uncurled, peering through his fingers. Kale was still kneeling beside him, his expression unreadable, but the air around him was thick with that calming, protective scent. It was a targeted application of pheromones, a clinical procedure in its own way, but it felt different. It felt like a shield. Kale saw the Omega's eyes focus on him. The terror was receding, replaced by a dazed confusion. The strategy was effective. He filed the data away for future reference. "You are safe," he repeated, his voice still low and steady. "I am here." Elian stared at him. The Alpha's scent was wrapping around him like a blanket, chasing away the last of the phantom chills. It was the most manipulative thing he had ever experienced, a chemical pacification that bypassed his will entirely. And yet, it was also the first time in his life he had ever felt truly safe. The paradox was a physical ache in his chest. He hated this alpha for his power, for his claim, for his calm, clinical possession. But his body, the traitorous vessel he was trapped in, was basking in the protective warmth. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped his eye and traced a path down his temple. Kale saw the drop of moisture, liquid secretion from the lacrimal gland, an indicator of extreme emotional distress or relief. His hand moved before his mind could process the command. He reached out and, with the gentle touch of a fingertip, brushed the tear from Ilian's skin. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure energy shot through Ilian, so powerful it made him gasp. Kael flinched back as if burned, retracting his hand, his own systems short-circuiting. The brief touch had sent a shockwave through the bond, a flare of shared sensation. Elian's deep, aching loneliness and Kael's profound, disciplined solitude crashing together for a single, blinding moment. They stared at each other, the air crackling with the aftershock. The cage was still there, but for the first time, something had passed through its bars. A connection, a terrifying, undeniable connection. Kyle stood abruptly, his movements stiff. He turned and walked to the door without another word, leaving Elian alone with the lingering warmth of his scent and the ghost of a touch on his skin. The silence that returned to the room was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of a shared feeling. The incident with the betas marked a subtle but profound shift in their dynamic. Kale no longer sat in the chair to observe him. Instead, he would bring a datapad into the room, ostensibly to work. But Elian could feel the alpha's attention on him, a constant, low-level hum. He was a variable Kale could not solve, a program that would not run according to its code. The food that appeared was no longer just the nutrient paste. Sometimes it was a broth that smelled of actual vegetables or a piece of dense, dark bread. Elian, weakened by his fast, began to eat. It was not a surrender. It was a strategic decision. He needed his strength, not to escape. He knew that was impossible, but to endure, to resist in a way that was more than just self-destruction. He would learn the rules of this new cage, and then he would find a way to break them from the inside. He began to ask Kale questions, reversing their established dynamic. He framed them as requests for data, using the language of the Institute to mask his true intent. "What is the hierarchical structure of the Enclave?" he asked one evening. "It is based on biological designation and proven capability," Kyle answered, not looking up from his datapad. "Alphas lead, betas support, omegas sustain." "Sustain what?" Elian pressed. "The community, the lineage. They provide stability." "By what metric is this stability measured?" Kyle finally looked up, his grey eyes narrowing slightly. No one had ever asked him to quantify the foundational principles of their society. They were simply accepted truths. Procreation rates, low incidence of internal conflict, pheromonal harmony. So, an omega's function is to be a biological pacifier and an incubator, Elian stated, his voice perfectly level. The clinical, dismissive summary made Kyle's jaw tighten. "It is a position of honor," he said, the words sounding hollow even to him. "Is it a position of choice?" Elian asked softly. Kyle did not answer. He returned his gaze to his datapad, but he did not read the words on the screen. The Omega's questions were like viruses, small lines of code that burrowed into his own programming and started to create errors. He had always seen the world as a series of logical systems, The Institute's system was flawed, based on the artificial suppression of nature. The Enclave system was superior, based on the structured acceptance of nature. But Elian's perspective suggested a third option, that any system that negated individual will was inherently flawed. It was a dangerously chaotic thought. "One cycle," Kale announced. "You will be assessed." Elian looked up from the bowl of broth he was sipping. Assessed by whom? The Council of Elders. They must ratify the bond. The bond. Elian repeated the words, tasting their bitterness. The chemical reaction you interpret as a proprietary claim. It is a biological reality, Kyle countered, his voice tight. They need to verify it, to ensure you are compatible with our ways. Elian understood. They wanted to see if the lab specimen could be domesticated. They wanted to inspect the new breeding stock. A cold, hard anger, something he hadn't felt in years, solidified in his chest. He would not be inspected like an animal. He would not perform for them. He would show them exactly what the Institute had created. A creature of perfect stillness, perfect control, and utter contempt for their biological pageantry. The assessment took place in a chamber that was clearly meant to be impressive. The walls were dark, polished stone, and a high domed ceiling was embedded with lights that mimicked a starry sky. 3 elders, 2 alphas, and 1 omega, all ancient and weathered, sat on a raised dais. They regarded him with the impassive curiosity of entomologists studying a new insect. Kyle stood slightly behind him, and to his right, a silent, powerful presence. Designation 734, the eldest alpha said, his voice a low rumble. You have no name. A name was not provided to me, Elian answered, his voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear coiling in his stomach. Centurion Kale claims you as mate, the Omega elder said, her voice surprisingly soft, yet laced with steel. Our bond is a sacred trust, a foundation of our society. You, a creature of the labs, what do you know of such things? They expected him to be afraid. They expected him to be cowed by their authority, to release placating pheromones, to show the deference of a proper Omega. Elian did the opposite. He drew on every technique the Institute had taught him for suppressing his biological responses. He locked down his scent, smoothed his features into a mask of polite indifference, and met the elder's gaze directly. I know of observation, he said. I know of data analysis. I know of stimulus and response. Your sacred trust appears to be a pheromonally induced state of codependency designed to ensure genetic propagation and social stability. It is a very efficient system. A shocked silence filled the chamber. The elders stared at him, their expressions hardening. To describe their most sacred belief in such cold, clinical terms was the highest form of blasphemy. The male alpha elder leaned forward, his scent flaring with anger. You are insolent. You have been raised without respect for the natural order. I was raised to respect data, Elian countered smoothly. The data shows that my designation is Omega. My biology dictates a response to an alpha. Centurion Kale is an alpha. Therefore, a response is occurring. This is the bond you wish to ratify. It is a chemical equation. I am simply acknowledging the variables. He was using their own logic against them, twisting the biological determinism they revered into a cold, empty science. He was showing them that he was not a participant in their culture, but an observer, an analyst. He was reducing them to a specimen under his own microscope. The Omega elder's eyes narrowed. And you feel nothing? No loyalty? No affection? Elian allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. The Institute discouraged inefficient emotional responses. They compromised the integrity of the data. He was a mirror, reflecting their own rigid system. Back at them in a distorted, sterile form they found monstrous. He could feel Kale's stillness behind him, a tense, vibrating energy. This was not going as planned. He had expected the Omega to be pliant, or at least fearful. Instead, he was performing a clinical vivisection of their entire culture, and Kale, to his own horror, found a part of himself agreeing with the Omega's cold logic. He was a product of the Enclave's system, but he was also a creature of pure tactical analysis, and the Omega's analysis was from a certain point of view flawless. The eldest Alpha rose to his feet, his massive frame radiating displeasure. This thing is broken. It is a shell. It cannot fulfill the duties of a mate. He turned his glare on Kale. Centurion, your instincts have failed you. This is no Omega. It is an Institute machine in the shape of a boy. Just as the elder spoke, Elian's control, strained by hunger and stress and the sheer force of will it took to maintain his facade, finally fractured. A wave of dizziness washed over him. The edges of his vision blurred, and the carefully constructed walls around his scent crumbled. For a single, unguarded moment, his true scent flooded the room. Not the placating, sweet scent of a submissive Omega, but something far more complex. The sharp ozone of a summer storm, the clean scent of rain on stone, and beneath it all, a deep, aching note of profound loneliness. It was the scent of a wild thing that had been caged for its entire life. It was raw, desperate, and utterly captivating. The angry Alpha Elder stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in shock. The scent was Omega, yes, but it was unlike any he had ever encountered. It was not a scent of submission. It was a scent of defiance, a scent of survival. Kale felt it like a punch to the gut. It was the scent he had first tracked in the forest, but 100 times more potent. It bypassed his logic, his training, his discipline, and spoke directly to the ancient predatory core of his being. An instinct, fierce and absolute, rose in him. Protect, defend, mine. Before anyone could react, he moved. He stepped forward, placing himself between Elian and the elders, his body a solid shield. He released his own scent, a powerful wave of ozone and steel, a clear, unmistakable claim that overwhelmed all other scents in the room. It was an act of pure, insubordinate defiance. "He is mine," Kale said, his voice a low growl that promised violence. "The bond is ratified." He had not asked. He had informed them. He had challenged the authority of the council itself, driven by an instinct he was only just beginning to understand. The elders stared, stunned into silence by his audacity. In that moment, Kale was not a centurion of the Enclave. He was just an alpha, protecting his mate. Elian, swaying on his feet behind the solid wall of Kyle's back, felt the alpha's protective scent wash over him. It was a cage, yes. But for the first time, he wondered if the door to that cage could be opened, not from the outside, but from within. The aftermath of the assessment was a profound and unsettling quiet. Kale did not speak of his defiance, and the council did not summon him for discipline. He had thrown down a gauntlet, a challenge so primal and absolute that the rigid structures of their society did not quite know how to process it. For now, he was untouchable, shielded by the sheer force of the bond he had declared. But they were both marked. Kale as a centurion whose loyalty was now suspect, and Elian as the strange, broken Omega who had provoked him. Their shared isolation in Kale's quarters became less a captivity and more of a strange, tense sanctuary. The dynamic between them was irrevocably altered. Kyle no longer treated Elian as a subject to be analyzed. He watched him with a new, troubled intensity, as if trying to see past the data and into the core of the boy himself. He started talking, not asking questions, but sharing fragments of his own life, his own conditioning. He spoke of the grueling training in the Centurion program, the endless drills designed to strip away individuality and forge a perfect soldier. He described the cold logic of the Enclave's battle strategies, the way lives were weighed as acceptable losses in the pursuit of a larger objective. "We are taught that emotion is a tactical liability," he said one evening, his voice a low murmur in the dim light. "Fear, anger, attachment, they are variables that can be exploited by the enemy." "And what is the enemy?" Elian asked, his voice soft. Kyle paused, the question catching him off guard. "The enemy is chaos," he answered, the words rote, learned from a manual. "Disorder, the systems outside the Enclave's influence. Like the Institute," Elian mused, "or the wilderness." "Yes, I have lived in a world of perfect order," Elian said, his gaze distant. "The only chaos was inside me. They tried to excise it. They taught me that my feelings, my instincts, my very nature, was a flaw in the design." He looked at Kale, his eyes clear and direct. "Your Enclave does not excise nature. It categorizes it. It puts it in a uniform. It gives it a rank. Is that so different?" Kale had no answer. Elian's words were dismantling his world, brick by logical brick. He had been forged into a weapon for a system he had never questioned. He was the embodiment of its order, its strength. But now, looking at the Omega, who saw the world with such painful clarity, he began to see the cracks in his own foundation. He started to see the cage he himself was in, one made not of concrete walls, but of duty, protocol, and a lifetime of unquestioning obedience. He brought Elian a mirror. It was a simple, polished sheet of metal, not the flawless glass of the Institute. He simply left it on the table and walked away. For a long time, Elian did not touch it. He remembered the mirror in his cell, the one that showed him a designation, a number. Finally, drawn by a reluctant curiosity, he picked it up. The face that looked back at him was thin and pale, the eyes large and shadowed. But it was his face, not Unit 734, not the specimen. He saw the faint, stinging line on his cheek from the branch in the forest. He saw the flicker of defiance in his own eyes. For the first time, he tried to find a name for the boy in the reflection. He could not. But he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that he was not nothing. He was a person, waiting to be discovered. The reflection wavered, and for a moment, he saw Kyle's face superimposed over his own, the two of them trapped together in the small, polished surface. He saw the same loneliness in the Alpha's severe features that he felt in his own heart. They were two sides of the same coin, two prisoners of different systems, meeting in the space between. The quiet was shattered by a sudden, blaring alarm that echoed through the entire sector. A lockdown siren. Kyle was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm that was no longer there. His quarters had no comms panel, a deliberate isolation. "What is it?" Elian asked, his heart beginning to pound. "An external breach," Kyle said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Highest level. It has to be." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The Institute. A cold dread, more profound than any fear he had felt before, washed over Elian. They had come for him, not with trackers this time, but with an infiltration force. They had come to sterilize their mistake. The door to the quarters slid open. A beta officer stood there, his face pale. "Centurion," he said, his voice strained. "The council summons you. They have a visitor." Kale's face was a mask of stone. He knew what this was, a test of loyalty, a final choice. He looked at Elian, and in his pale grey eyes, Elian saw a conflict so profound it was like watching a mountain crack in two. Duty versus instinct, the system versus the bond. "Stay here," Kyle commanded, his voice rough. "Do not open this door for anyone." He turned and strode out, the beta officer falling into step behind him. The door slid shut, leaving Elian once again alone in the silent grey cube. But this time, the silence was not empty. It was filled with a terrifying, imminent threat. He was the prize in a war between two systems of control, and he was about to be reclaimed by his original owners. He paced the small room like a caged animal, his mind racing. He could not just wait. He could not be a passive specimen, waiting for his fate to be decided by others. He thought of the Institute, of its protocols, its weaknesses. He thought of Director Aris, the man who had overseen his entire life. Aris was a creature of logic, of predictable patterns. He disdained brute force. His weapon was psychology, manipulation. He would not have sent a simple assault team. He would have sent a specialist, a cleaner, someone who understood the system, both the institutes and, likely, the enclaves. Someone who could talk their way in, exploit the cracks, and retrieve the asset with surgical precision. The door hissed open. Elian spun around, his body tensing for a fight he could not win. It was not Kale. It was a man he recognized with a sickening lurch of his stomach. A man he had seen observing him through the sterile glass of the lab, his face always calm, his eyes holding a reptilian intelligence. It was Director Aris himself. He was dressed not in a lab coat, but in a simple, elegant, dark suit that looked utterly out of place in the military starkness of the Enclave. He was flanked by two Enclave guards, beta soldiers, whose faces were blank, their eyes distant. They were under his control. Pheromonal persuasion, or something more advanced. Aris smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "Hello, 734, he said, his voice the same soft, sympathetic tone that had always preceded a painful procedure. "It is time to come home." Kyle stood before the Council of Elders. The chamber was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Director Aris was there, a serpent in their midst, seated as if he were an honored guest. Kyle understood immediately. The council was using this as an opportunity. They would trade the Omega, the source of Kale's insubordination, back to the Institute. In doing so, they would secure a political alliance and rid themselves of a problematic asset, all while reasserting their control over their wayward Centurion. It was a ruthlessly efficient solution. "Centurion Kale," the eldest Alpha said, his voice heavy with false regret. "Director Aris has made us a most generous offer. Advanced medical technology, energy credits, in exchange for the return of their stolen property." "He is not property," Kyle said, his voice dangerously low. "He is a refugee under my protection." Aris chuckled softly, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, Centurion, your biology is deceiving you. It is not a refugee. It is a highly specialized piece of equipment that has malfunctioned. It needs to be recalled and recalibrated. or if the damage is too extensive, decommissioned. The clinical, detached way he spoke of Elian, of the boy he had claimed, of the being who was slowly unraveling his entire world, ignited a cold, pure rage in Kyle's chest. The last vestiges of his conditioning, of his loyalty to the system, burned away in that fire. He saw the elders not as wise leaders, but as cowardly politicians. He saw Aris not as a diplomat, but as a monster hiding in a man's skin. And he saw his path with absolute, terrifying clarity. "No," Kyle said. The word was quiet, but it resonated through the chamber with the force of an explosion. He turned his gaze from the elders to Aris. "He stays with me." Aris's smile widened. "I was afraid you would be unreasonable. Your pheromonal attachment is, I admit, stronger than our initial projections accounted for. A fascinating data point." He gestured to the guards at his side. "Fortunately, I came prepared for such a contingency." The guards raised their pulse rifles, aiming them directly at Kale. The elders on the dais flinched, shocked at this breach of protocol, this blatant act of aggression in their sacred chamber. They had invited the Viper in, and now it was turning on them. "You see, Centurion," Aris continued, his voice conversational, "your enclave values order, structure. I am simply restoring it, returning a missing piece to its proper place. Your council agrees. They will not interfere." Kyle looked at the rifle muzzles. He calculated the odds. He could disable both guards in under 3 seconds, but not before at least one of them got a shot off. And Ares would be his primary target, a messy, unpredictable conflict. But as he prepared to move, a new voice cut through the tension. "It won't work, Director." Elian stood in the doorway of the chamber, his posture straight, his face pale but resolute. He was not supposed to be there. The guards Aris had posted at his quarters. Aris's eyes narrowed. 734, you are out of your designated area." "My name," Elian said, his voice ringing with a strength no one in the room had ever heard from him, "is Elian." He took a step into the chamber. Kyle's every instinct screamed at him to pull the Omega back, to shield him. But he held his ground, sensing that this was a battle Elian had to fight himself. "Your guards are suggestible," Elian said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "You taught me a great deal about psychological conditioning, Director, about stimulus and response. I simply provided them with a new stimulus. He had not fought them. He had talked to them. He had used the knowledge of their rigid beta psychology, their desire for clear commands, and exploited the subtle gaps in Aris's control, planting seeds of doubt, contradicting orders with carefully crafted logic until they were frozen in indecision. It was a tactic straight from Aris's own playbook. Aris's smile finally faltered. The asset was learning, evolving. "A clever trick," he conceded, "but irrelevant. You're still outnumbered. You are still cornered." "Am I?" Elian looked past Aris, his gaze sweeping over the elders. "You believe he is offering you technology, an alliance. He is offering you a leash. The Institute does not form partnerships. It absorbs. It acquires. Today, he comes for me. Tomorrow, he will come for your children, for any Omega, any Alpha, with a unique genetic marker he finds interesting. You will all become specimens, designations in his grand experiment." His words, cold and logical, struck a chord of fear in the elders that Kyle's primal defiance could not. They looked at Aris, at his calm, predatory smile, and for the first time they saw the truth of Elian's warning. They saw their future as a control group. The moment of hesitation was all Kale needed. He moved, not with the explosive rage of before, but with the cold, brutal efficiency of a centurion at work. The first guard went down with a precise strike to the throat. The second managed to fire his rifle, but Kale was already moving, using the guard's own body as a shield. The pulse blast hit the beta's armored vest, sending him staggering back. Kale disarmed him in a fluid motion and leveled the rifle at Aris. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Aris stood perfectly still, his smile gone, replaced by a look of cold fury. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the Omega's intellect and the Alpha's combat prowess. "This changes nothing," Aris hissed. "The Institute will not forget this. We will sterilize this entire primitive enclave from orbit if we have to." Before Kale could respond, Elian spoke again, his voice cutting through the air. "You can't." All eyes turned to him. "The main reactor for this facility," Elian said, looking directly at Aris. "It's a Tier 4 quantum cascade model. Am I correct?" Aris's eyes widened, almost imperceptibly. That was classified information. "They are notoriously unstable if the containment field is compromised," Elian continued, his voice gaining strength. "A single, well-placed pulse blast to the primary energy conduit that runs directly beneath this chamber would trigger a full-core meltdown. The resulting blast would not only vaporize this entire structure, but would also destabilize the tectonic plate it's built on. The Institute's regional headquarters, I believe, is located less than 100 kilometers from here. It would be compromised." He was bluffing. He had to be. But the level of technical detail was flawless. The knowledge was something only a high-level Institute analyst would possess. He had spent 19 years listening, observing, absorbing data that everyone assumed he was too passive to understand. Kyle stared at him, a sense of profound awe dawning on his face. This was not a broken specimen. This was a weapon, a mind forged in the enemy's own fire. Aris stared at Elian, his cold, calculating mind running the probabilities. The Omega's bluff was perfect. There was no way to know for sure without risking mutual annihilation. To press the attack was an unacceptable risk. With a final, venomous glare, Aris slowly raised his hands. "It appears we are at an impasse," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "For now." The crisis was over. But in the silent, charged aftermath, a new reality settled in. Kale had defied the Council. Elian had threatened the entire enclave. They had won, but in doing so, they had made themselves enemies of both worlds. They were no longer a centurion and his captive. They were two fugitives, bound together, not just by a chemical bond, but by a shared act of rebellion. They were alone, together. They left under the cover of the simulated night, the same darkness that had once hidden Elian in his desperate flight. This time, there was no fear, only a quiet, resolute purpose. The Council, shamed and frightened into a state of paralysis, had allowed them to walk away. It was easier than dealing with the consequences of their existence. Kale was no longer in uniform. He wore simple, dark fatigues and carried a pack with minimal supplies. Elian wore a similar outfit, the practical, durable fabric a world away from the thin tunic he had arrived in. They moved through the sterile corridors of the enclave, their footsteps echoing in the silence. No one stopped them. They were ghosts, already erased from the system. As they reached the great gate that led to the wilderness, Kale paused. He looked at Elian, his face illuminated by the cold, artificial light. "Where we are going," he said, his voice low. There is no system, no protocol. It will be chaotic. Elian met his gaze, his eyes reflecting a quiet strength. I have lived my entire life in a cage of perfect order, he replied. I think I am ready for some chaos. Kale nodded, a rare, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He pushed the gate control, and the massive doors hissed open, revealing the dark, breathing expanse of the forest beyond. The air that washed over them was cool and damp, rich with the scent of pine and wet earth. It was the scent of freedom. They stepped out of the enclave and into the night. The gate slid shut behind them, the sound a final, definitive severing of their pasts. For a long moment, they stood in silence, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness, letting the wild, untamed sounds of the forest wash over them. The moon, a sliver of silver in the cloudy sky, cast long, dancing shadows through the trees. It was the same forest Elian had stumbled through, terrified and alone. But now, it felt different. It was no longer a place of menace, but a place of possibility. Kyle stood beside him, a solid, comforting presence. The bond between them was a quiet hum beneath the surface, no longer a chain, but an anchor in the vast, uncertain world ahead. It was not a destiny that had been forced upon them, but a choice they were now actively making with every step they took away from the lives they had known. I was wrong, Kyle said, his voice soft in the stillness. Elian turned to look at him, a question in his eyes. In the forest, Kyle clarified. When I found you, I gave you a designation, and I gave you a label. Mate. He looked down at Elian, his pale eyes searching, vulnerable in a way Elian had never seen. I did not ask for your name. You didn't know it, Elian said, his voice gentle. Neither did I. A sense of profound peace settled over him. The numbers tattooed on his skin were just ink. Your conditioning was just programming, and it could be rewritten. The boy in the mirror now had a name. Elian. He had given it to himself in an act of defiance, and in doing so had claimed his own existence. He was not a designation, not a specimen, not just a mate. He was Elian, and his life, for the first time, was his own to define. Kale reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, just as he had done in that first meeting in the cave. This time, Elian did not flinch. He watched the hand, then lifted his own and placed it in the alpha's much larger one. Kyle's fingers closed around his grip firm and steady. The contact was not a jolt of energy this time, but a slow, spreading warmth. It was a promise, a partnership. They stood there for a moment longer, two solitary figures against the vast, dark wilderness, their hands clasped. They were fugitives, outcasts from two opposing worlds. They had no allies, no destination, no plan beyond survival. But they had each other. They had a bond that had been forged not in biology alone, but in shared trauma, in mutual defiance, and in the quiet, dawning recognition of the person within the label. Together, they turned from the cold, grey wall of the enclave and walked into the deep, welcoming darkness of the woods. The path was unknown, but for the first time in their lives, they were both truly, completely free. The scent of pine was the scent of home.